Hello, everybody. My name is Anthony Brennan, and I'm a market analyst at FutureSource Consulting. I'm really happy to be here today talking about IP as the universal language of AV. Now, this is such a wide-ranging topic. You know, we could easily speak for 2-3 conference days, or, you know, we regularly speak with clients for entire days about subjects like this. So what I've got is about 20 minutes, so I've tried to pick some exciting areas that hopefully you'll find, you know, interesting, engaging, and thought-provoking. But firstly, unfortunately, I'm sort of forced to do this by our marketing department. But I am conscious that some of you in the audience might not be aware of who FutureSource are, and at the moment, I'm just a, jet-lagged Englishman speaking to you early on a Tuesday morning. So FutureSource are a strategic market intelligence consultancy specializing in media, content, and related hardware. We are headquartered in the UK, but very much have a global remit. Our company broadly covers these 3 areas. That's content. We look pretty much anywhere that digital content is created and have services to track that. We also look at how that digital content is delivered, from packaged media, Blu-ray, DVD, all the way through to mobile, IP, broadband. And finally, this sort of section around the edge, equipment, that broadly splits into consumer electronics and B2B. Obviously, I come from the B2B side. But what does that actually mean? It means that we can look at incredible detail vertically, but also horizontally. So if we take a topic like 4K and its impact on AV over IP, which I'll be speaking about later, we understand the amount of cameras that capture 4K, the amount of 4K content being created, and the amount of displays that are actually able to show 4K, which allows us to have a more reasoned and reasonable discussion about the AV over IP market. But ultimately, when I was first given this topic, IP is the universal language of AV, I think there was lots of different ways I could take this. But the first thing that really sprang to mind for me was this idea of convergence, or disruption, as Sean mentioned. But it's this convergence of pro AV, of IT, of consumer electronics, the stuff that we've been speaking about for a very long time now, and it's a bit of an old and tired topic, but ultimately, I believe we've seen a quickening of pace of this convergence. And it's really things like IoT, big data, network bandwidth capabilities getting more powerful, connected devices, all of these things that are really causing this convergence of different industries to come together. Now, you'll all be very familiar with all of these buzzwords, but I did want to pick out just a couple to sort of develop that idea of IP as a universal language of AV. So firstly, analytics, visualization, hundreds of thousands of connected devices, sending huge amounts of data to the cloud and creating significant business possibilities in doing so. This is such a hot topic in the AV industry. How can AV companies add value here? And this really is the future of the AV industry, ISC and Infocom and all the companies involved are really evolving to reflect that, a trend that's been built upon by IP. If we take smart environments, for example, a topic that's pretty familiar to us at FutureSource, particularly our colleagues in consumer electronics who work in the smart home space very extensively, but obviously huge ramifications for the B2B world. We all know smart buildings, smart campuses, devices becoming more intelligent and allowing us to do more things with them. And we could pick loads of different topics here, from robotics to machine learning to analytics, IoT. There's just a huge amount of things that we could think about. But today, I'm really focusing on the pro AV industry and the rising importance of IT and the network across a huge range of markets, from displays to digital signage to video conferencing, control and automation, wireless presentation. The network forms a fundamental part of the pro AV industry. But ultimately, who cares? Why do we care about IP? It just seems like a bit of a buzzword. And I think if you speak with sort of AV guys, IT seems a bit distant and remote. You speak with IT guys, AV seems a little bit like a dark art. But ultimately, I think it is having a very important impact. And it's quite interesting to frame it in a certain way. So if we think about sort of three things. One, more connected devices being hung off the back of a network. And that really revolutionizes the way that we can deliver AV. The second is what we get back from those devices, and how can AV companies add value in terms of visualization and analytics that I spoke about before. And the third one is, what about AV managed services? How can we control and manage those AV assets remotely? And I think that's a really hot topic as well. In fact, FutureSource has just done a study about AV managed services, and that market is really seeing double-digit growth. So what I'm going to try and do today is just talk about a couple of examples of the wider impact of IP before going into just a couple of product category areas. So firstly, how big an impact are these things actually having? And I think there's two important considerations to think about here. One is those changing channel dynamics, and the second is the greater role of IT managers and IT departments in influencing purchasing decisions. So if we think about that first point, changing channel dynamics, a lot of those topics, blurring of IT and AV, and IT distributors taking on more AV specialists and selling more AV products. But I think it's more than that. The channel is getting more and more complicated. Rise of telcos, AV managed service providers, online, IT, AV. It's a very convoluted, complex space. And I think a really interesting use case that we see that really demonstrates how the channel is changing is if we think about the education space. And if we specifically think about the education space in the US versus the UK. If we think about the UK, deals in K-12 are done on a school-by-school basis, which means that we've got a lot of small AV and IT specialists competing for relatively smaller deals. If we compare that with the US, where deals in the K-12 space are done on a district-by-district basis, it means those deals are much bigger, the market is more consolidated around 5 or 6 big IT suppliers, which means these big IT players are competing against established competition, really trying to push their nose in front by selling more AV products, more additional AV services. In fact, we speak a lot with higher education institutions to understand their technology spend. And our latest results show that, particularly in the US, higher education institutions rely much more on IT distributors for their AV needs than anywhere else in the world. The second comment I wanted to bring onto here is the greater role of IT departments and ICT managers. And I think this is quite an obvious point, but there is some really important elements here. With more devices being connected, what does it mean for manufacturers and vendors? Well, it means that they are taking greater care to think about network security. They're taking greater care to think about how devices interact with other devices in the network traffic and all of these things. And then the second point is really that in a very literal sense, AV companies have to speak the language of IT. And in fact, a quarter of US companies say that the key influencer is the ICT manager, that point in red. So without being able to speak the language of IP, you're going to be potentially losing a quarter of business. So that's pretty significant. But now I want to talk specifically about just a couple of product category examples to really highlight some of the disruptive impact that's happening here. Now, I think AV over IP is a really good way of thinking about IP as the universal language of AV. FutureSource has been tracking the matrix switcher market on a customized basis for around 6 or 7 years now. And obviously, as that market has developed and IP has become more of a disruptive technology, that's really led us into that space around 4 years ago to map specifically the low latency Pro AV applications. So all we're talking about here is low latency, LAN-based AV over IP, really the high-end specialist segment of the market. So we're not considering, or I'm not going to be talking about sort of these higher latency applications. But I think it's particularly interesting that we look at this low latency aspect of the market, because in many ways it really resembles some of the more traditional aspects of the AV world. You know, that obsession over pixel pitch, over resolution, over latency, over quality, all of these things that the AV world is very good at. And it's really interesting to see how that plays out when we're talking about packetizing data and sending it through a network and network layers and protocols. But ultimately, AV over IP is a really rapidly growing market. And just remember, we're only talking about the low latency stuff here. 246,000 units sold of encoders and decoders in 2018 alone. 61% year-on-year increase, and a CAGR of nearly 30%. So really significant things happening here. And why is that? Well, that's, more intelligent chipsets and codecs which allow greater quality compression and at a lower latency. It's widespread 1G network architecture across businesses. We see it really dominant in Western Europe and the US and Northern Europe, for example. And it's the number of brands that are operating in this market. Now, this is just a fraction of the brands operating here. And I always feel a little bit bad putting brand slides up because somebody will always call you out and say, why aren't we on there? So apologies if you're not included on there. But ultimately, there's 40, 50 brands operating in this space. And I think that's a really interesting point on IP's impact on wider markets in general, and the way that it lowers those barriers to entry and is very disruptive coming into the market. If we think traditionally about the matrix switcher space and big installs in corporates, there's only a very small handful of brands that are able to compete in those projects, and we all know who those brands are. But ultimately, what AV over IP does, in many ways, is it levels that playing field, so that mid-tier companies, medium-sized companies, are actually able to compete in those bigger and bigger installs, really lowering those barriers to entry. But ultimately, there's a lot of questions that need to be answered here. What about legacy non-IP standards like HDBaseT? Where do they fit in versus IP? Because obviously, this is just a very small portion of the total number of ports in the market. What about 1G versus 10G? And in a similar vein, compression versus light compression? And how are more intelligent codecs going to impact that? And how about hybrid versus dedicated networks? Where are you putting the AV? If you speak to IT managers, they'll say, there's absolutely no way that it's going on a hybrid network with the rest of our network traffic. Most of it's dedicated now. But all of these really big, hard questions, I'm conveniently going to leave for the panel to discuss afterwards as I move on. So AV over IP is a really good example of the disruptive potential of IP in the AV world. And it's stuff like flexibility, scalability, the possibility of having these really big projects that were previously completely unthinkable across a range of applications, from corporate, connecting trading floors, lobby rooms, meeting spaces, other areas in businesses, to healthcare, connecting surgical theaters with breakout rooms, to education, connecting university campuses, and allowing these really innovative active learning suites to develop to command and control. There's so many different AV over IP applications that, yes, have been done for many years in the legacy environment, but are really innovative. But ultimately, the market is still relatively early in its adoption life cycle. And there continue to be significant barriers to wider adoption. And I think some of these are indicative of IP's wider role in the market. Things like price point, particularly in small installs. If you have a small install, then it's still way cheaper to just use a legacy non-IP extension. It's a fact. Stuff like the channel, unwilling to wholeheartedly adopt IP solutions because legacy solutions have better margins and there's more staff that are used to selling legacy solutions and those so sell them. Stuff like uncertainty, huge amounts of infighting in the industry. You'll walk around Infocom over the next few days and every company will say, we can do that, they can't do that, we've got the better quality, and it just is confusing end users. And education, that lack of networking expertise, which is particularly important if we consider the fact that IT departments and ICT departments are really important in influencing those purchasing decisions. But ultimately, this is a really, really positive market and a very disruptive one. So I don't want to overstate these points, but I think they are important to discuss. Now, I also wanted to briefly talk about the video conferencing space as well. And I know there's going to be a lot on UCC later, so I won't go into this in too much detail. But again, used to be a market that was highly specialized, servicing boardrooms and telepresence suites, and offered by only a handful of brands. But now video is very much anywhere, anytime, and on any device, covering a vast number of product category areas, from software-agnostic peripherals to room hubs to displays with video conferencing capability, and also telepresence suites and single codecs, the older sort of stuff. But this rapid evolution in this space has really been caused by those advancements in IP and that movement from a hard codec solution to a cloud-based software solution. The market is really starting to speak the language of AV. And I think this really brings up that idea of convergence that I spoke about earlier as well. Convergence of IT, of AV, of UC&C, and of consumer electronics, and all of these consumer solutions coming in. But ultimately, today, I just wanted to finish on data analytics as the next frontier. Again, a bit of a sort of mega trend, but something that I think is so important to the industry. And data analytics is really growing in importance across a whole range of markets, from VC to displays to wireless pres. And this is just such a small slice of brands. By no means is this the total number of brands doing really innovative stuff in this industry. There's huge amounts of people. And I think there's some really interesting examples of the efficiencies that can be gained. I was speaking with large corporates that were saying that they were not only able to manage their space more efficiently as a result of analytics, they were able to make cost savings on cleaning by directing, through using AV analytics, directing cleaning staff to areas that needed to be cleaned and didn't need to be cleaned, and they're making efficiencies there. So really innovative things happening on the back of the rise of IP. So this really leaves me with the question that I've been skirting around throughout this presentation today, that ultimately, how can AV companies maintain and add value during this period of convergence and as IP becomes more of a universal language of AV? And that's the sort of thought that I wanted to leave you all on today. So thank you very much.